I'm really thrilled to be here with you all tonight. And first, I just want to say thank you for the really lovely service. Um, I'm a member of a synagogue in Toronto, and I very much like this congregation. And I think after this service tonight, I will be attending more often. It's so lovely. Um, so I want to thank Ray and all the others in the congregation in the Talmud class, Michael De Vera, for inviting me because as they got to know me and they got to know a little bit about me, they began to have more interest. Just very briefly, there is no clarity around how I arrived at the Talmud class in a congregation in New York from Canada. I have zero knowledge of how this happened. It's a bit curious, so I'm happy I'm here. What I'm here to talk about is my book, which is behind me here. It's called When Gender is in Question, A Guide to Understanding. I spent about 4 years writing this book and self-published it at the end of December last year. And so since then, I have been speaking about this topic. It's a book I wish I had written, a book I wish I had about 10 years ago, when my youngest child began to question their gender. And I did not know anything about the topic. And so what happened let's say 12 years ago was my child, so I gave birth to 2 daughters, and the youngest one, maybe 21 years old, came home during a break from university and said, "Ma, I'd like to show you some, what we would now call blogs, but they called videos." And I said, "Okay, great," thinking that it was like jammy time and popcorn. And I said, "Okay." And so we got comfortable and hung out in their room, and shoulder to shoulder, we set up the laptop and started watching these videos. And I just thought it was going to be an entertaining time and looking forward to this kind of bonding. Well, what was in front of me, so this was 12 years ago, right? So what was in front of me was scene after scene of a young people being in front of the camera and speaking about questioning about their gender. Other videos were about people who had already had surgery, so top surgery. So there was one young person who lifted up their shirt and it showed scars on camera, and they looked so painful, but the look on their face with such elation and such pride. And I'm watching these videos, and I turned to my child and I said, "What are we watching here?" And they turned to me and they said, "Ma, I think I'm a guy." That's what has been so confusing to me for so long. And I will tell you in a few minutes the many notes, the many points along the way that were apparent, that presented themselves to us, but I missed. It was like these breadcrumbs that should have spoken to me but didn't. Anyway, I embraced it. I was not sure about anything, and I began to read and I began to learn. I found a lot of books out there that were written by trans people, but nothing that really spoke to me. And so we just kind of plodded along. And here's what happened is that my ex-husband, who I'm very good friends with, and my child who has renamed himself Skylar, his older sister Lauren. Um, we all just came together as a family. There was no question that there would not be any judgment. We just all came together. What do we do? And so we all sorted it out. I mean, this was before Caitlyn Jenner. This was before Orange is the New Black. This is before any of the language came into the public. And so we just supported him in his transition. I mean, this was his first rodeo in gender transition and ours too. So we all just worked together. What began to occur to me and what I began to hear from my otherwise liberal-minded, educated, friends, family, community was, wow, Susie, you seem so cool about this. Like, I don't know that I would be able to have such a chilled attitude as you're having. And that confused me, that I was just embracing this as something new, but okay. And everyone so many others seem to have an issue with it. That's what I actually began to pay attention to. And I began to suddenly be aware of the language and the debates around gender identity, because, as for most of us, unless we are personally impacted by something, we pay attention, but in a cursory or in a distant way. The moment things begin to really impact us, then we're really paying attention. And so I began to really read and recognize that there was a whole discussion out there, both in Canada and raging in the United States, around gender rights. Public bathroom rights, surgery rights, and I began to pay attention to it and recognize this was really an issue that people are struggling with. I didn't feel I was struggling with it, and our family didn't feel they were struggling with it. We were just embracing it, moving into what we needed to do. And so as Skylar moved through his transition, and I can tell you now, 12 years later, that he, at the age of 33, is this healthy, handsome young guy with the, beard, and he's a psychotherapist who's just getting his finishing his paperwork and certification, living with his partner, and just really managing his life happily. Way more happily than he was before he transitioned. He is the same person, just way happier. And so I began, once things sorted out with Skylar and he had some surgery and he began, and his life settled down, I began to think about how to then share this information and this journey with others. So as Devera has said, I used to go on long bike rides because that's where I do my thinking. And I put together this little pad that would fit into my leather jacket. And every time I would have an idea of how to actually talk about this, I would, pull over to the side, stop, pull out my paper and pen and, write my idea. And so I spent 4 years writing a book that included information about what gender diversity is about. And I wrote a chapter for workplaces because I am a mediator, a coach, a trainer, and I go into workplaces now and I talk to workplaces about how to integrate gender diversity. I included a chapter around bathrooms. I included a chapter around languaging and the words. And when I finished it, I recognized that if I had had this book, my journey of being a parent a welcoming parent, but a confused parent would have been a whole lot easier. So that's basically the history of the book. And now what I do is I hold monthly dialogues to bring people into the space of discussion around gender. In fact, just last night, I had a really interesting dialogue around how that involved my own rabbi and an indigenous two-spirit person, also a reverend who is from a church, a metropolitan community church that has a very diverse queer community, and a Holocaust survivor who turned Sufi, who is now into the interfaith religion, all of these. And we were talking about how to bring gender neutrality into these spaces. And and so instead of having a bar mitzvah and a bat mitzvah, how do we change the language around that? How do we integrate a young person who at the age of 10 or 11 or 12 is questioning their gender or identifying in a different way other than their birth gender? How do we integrate that in the Jewish community? How do we talk about God that isn't gender binary? And so these were some of the questions that I was talking about last night. And the deeper I get into thinking about gender, the more I recognize that so much of our lives, our world, is impacted by gender. And most of us come at it with a very gender binary approach. Most of us grew up with, boys and girls. Even, in the early days, bars had men's entrance and women's entrance, very binary. And now I'm finding it more current thinking that people are looking at it in a gender plural way or a gender fluid way. So I'm going to be very curious to answer questions, but I want to say that as a sort of a key message here, without getting into the specifics of what a transgender journey is about, I do want to say that the very bottom line, what is the absolute key message here, is that when someone, a child or a partner or a community member, shows themselves to be identifying with a gender that is outside our expectation or assumption, the invitation here and the hope is that we all just get curious, not judgmental, that we don't judge, that we don't dissociate, that we don't excommunicate, as has been the case so frequently. I know of a young woman who came from a multi-generation rabbinic family and was born male and was set up to be a rabbi, probably, fifth or sixth generation rabbinic. And this young person had huge courage to stand up and say, I need to identify with my authentic gender. And unfortunately, despite their pleas and despite their very well-researched references to their rabbinic father, he decided that he wanted nothing to do with his child, who had transitioned into a female, and she was excommunicated from the family. Her other 5 or 6 siblings don't speak to her. Her father doesn't speak to her. she has actually written a book, and that's available. I think it's called Becoming Eve. So, and this was just months ago. So there, our Jewish tradition is very has so many beautiful, wonderful, historic influences and traditions, and it also has a tendency for those who are very observant to maintain that and not open up to the possibility of other expressions in gender identity or sexual orientation. And so if there's one thing that I'm hoping my book will do, is to open people's hearts, challenge their thinking, and allow them to make decisions and relationships based on a broader view of possibility of life, rather than maintaining a narrow frame of traditional behavior and expectation.